Hello, students. We are going to talk about narrators, theme, motif, and symbol for this week's lecture. So we have, first, reliable and not so reliable narrators. Reliable narrators are dutifully trustworthy. Readers trust that the narrator tells the story like it is and from a reasonable perspective. Fewer and fewer stories, I think, use absolutely reliable narrators these days, and it was something really new and different back in the day when um, it was thought that characters could tell stories in a different way. Unreliable narrators, I think, are lots more fun. These are not trustworthy nor necessarily even sane. The action and the other characters are skewed to the narrator's perspective. They don't realize that they're warped a lot of times, but sometimes they do. Certainly the audience gets a sense of that, and of course the author does this on purpose. This is not some sort of accidental thing that happens. So I happen to think that unreliable narrators are lots of fun. So I have a couple of examples for you. One is from a poem, and I include a web address at the end of this lecture. And the poem is by Robert Browning. And it was written a long time ago in the early 1800s, if I remember right. And so the language is stilted like that. But I'll read you the selection. The poem is called My Last Duchess. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will't please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of you. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Now, I read this in the voice of the narrator, who is full of himself. It took a while of study and discussion in class to get the sense of that this Duke murdered his last Duchess, looking as if she were alive. And when he says her beautiful glance came not just at her husband's look, but Fra Pandolf, who was the painter. And Fra Pandolf perhaps complimented her, and of course her looks went everywhere, which meant her eyes looked around too much. And that's not the end of the poem. The poem goes on a little bit, and if you're up for a challenge, I would suggest that you read this poem, and you'll have to read it several times over to be able to figure it out. The next one is a short story that you may have read in other classes called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She's another example of an unreliable narrator. So the character in this story is almost kept prisoner by her husband, and he thinks that she's sick. She has just had a baby. She's not allowed to even see the baby, and they keep her up in a room, uh, ostensibly to keep her from hurting herself or to be hysterical or whatever. And so she's kind of trapped in this room, and she starts looking at the wallpaper. And so I'll read you a little bit from that story. And I also included a website where you can find the story online. This is about maybe 2/3 of the way through, getting toward the end. So the wallpaper develops its more negative characteristics over time. On a pattern like this, she means the wallpaper, by daylight, there is a lack of sequence, a defiance of law, that is a constant irritant to a normal mind. The color is hideous enough and unreliable enough and infuriating enough, but the pattern is torturing. You think you've mastered it, but just as you get well underway in following, it turns a back somersault, and there you are. It slaps you in the face, knocks you down, and tramples upon you. It is like a bad dream. The outside pattern is a florid arabesque, reminding one of a fungus. If you imagine a toadstool in joints, an interminable string of toadstools, budding and sprouting in endless convolutions, why, that is something like it. That is, sometimes. There is one marked peculiarity about this paper, a thing no one seems to notice but myself, and that is that it changes as the light changes. When the sun shoots in through the east window, I always watch for that first long straight ray. It changes so quickly that I can never quite believe it. That is why I watch it always. By moonlight, the moon shines in all night when there is a moon. I wouldn't know it was the same paper. At night, in any kind of light, in twilight, candlelight, lamplight, and worst of all by moonlight, it becomes bars, the outside pattern I mean, and the woman behind it is as plain as could be. I didn't realize for a long time that the thing that was showed behind, that dim sub-pattern, but now I am quite sure it is a woman. By daylight she is subdued, quiet. I fancy it is the pattern that keeps her so still. It is so puzzling, it keeps me quiet by the hour. I lie down ever so much now. John says it's good for me to sleep all I can. Indeed, he started the habit by making me lie down for an hour after each meal. It is a very bad habit, I'm convinced, for you see I don't sleep. And that cultivates deceit, for I don't tell him I'm awake. Oh, no. The fact is, I'm getting a little afraid of John. He seems very queer sometimes, and even Jenny has an inexplicable look. It strikes me occasionally, just as a scientific hypothesis, that perhaps it is the paper. I have watched John when he did not know I was looking, and come into the room suddenly on the most innocent of excuses, and I've caught him several times looking at the paper. And Jenny, too. I caught Jenny with her hand on it once. And I'll leave the rest to you. It's kind of a fun story. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. Is she sane? Is she not? That is for you to decide. Theme is the main idea behind a story. It is not the same as the plot. There may be more than one theme, too, so if I ask you about theme sometime, what your job is to give evidence for what you think is the theme, not that Stephen King or whoever we're reading at the time had some particular theme in mind, although perhaps they do. But the theme speaks to how the story speaks to the human condition. So a theme is suffering, or it's poverty, or in the case of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, It's the condition of women in the late 19th century who were thought to be hysterical and controlled by their husbands. Theme can be all sorts of different things, but it's ways that the story speaks to the human condition. A motif highlights the theme. Motifs are recurring images that point to or illustrate the theme. A motif might be an object or part of an object, or a snippet of conversation or a recurring saying, or it might even be a character. And I have a couple of examples for you here. Mirrors can be motifs, and it might reflect a theme of, no pun intended, of reflection, or maybe even what one sees in the mirror is not the same as the person, something like that. In Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the wallpaper, I would think, is a motif that it covers up, what is really there. Wallpaper itself, say nothing of what's in there. In the little snippet I read, there's a woman behind bars that the narrator sees. I'm a Stephen King fan, so I would call the characters who scoped out Las Vegas, they are sent as spies into Las Vegas, which sort of symbolizes evil in Stephen King's novel The Stand. And each of these characters represents good in a little bit different way. One by toughness, one by justice. They're all good. They symbolize good in a different way. Oh, another theme that I get from Stephen King, and this is something that he does often, and that is he has recurring snippets of conversation. And in one novel, I can't remember if it's The Dead Zone or a different one, the protagonist keeps thinking about a carnival barker who had said just before a significant event in the novel that had set in motion a course of events. You pays your money, you takes your chances. You pays your money, you takes your chances. And that thought keeps coming into that character's mind. There's a couple of snippets of conversation from The Stand. If you've read it, these will be familiar to you. The character, one of the best examples of goodness in the whole book, is this guy who starts out really superficial and kind of a jerk named Larry Underwood. And Larry Underwood really does have a heart of gold. But at the very beginning, this girl who spent the night with him yells at him and says, "You ain't no nice guy." And Larry carries that around with him, and it keeps coming back into his mind. You ain't no nice guy. So that's a motif also. Also in The Stand, Mother Abigail says, "Rats in the corn, rats in the corn." And that too is a motif. The symbol is not unlike a motif, but it maybe more directly stands for something. It's an object that represents something else, usually an idea related to the theme. So symbols in Stephen King's The Stand, the dark man represents the devil, evil, etc. Mother Abigail represents God, goodness, etc. Las Vegas represents decadence and maybe hell and a place of evil. So there you have it. Narrators, themes, motifs, symbols. And if you're interested, go to My Last Duchess and the Yellow Wallpaper and read those for yourselves. See you next time.